The president last night was, for lack of a better word, presidential.
This new presidential Trump.
It was a presidential.
He was presidential.
Very presidential.
Very presidential.
Very presidential.
Very, dare I say, presidential.
Dare I say presidential.
This was so presidential.
Much more presidential.
Almost startleringly typically presidential.
This is the first time that he's presidential.
He's getting high marks even from some of his critics for sounding presidential.
He managed to sound presidential.
He sounded very presidential.
He was sounding very presidential. He sounded presidential and looked presidential. He looked and sounded presidential.
He looked very presidential.
He looked incredibly presidential.
This was a real presidential pivot, as they're saying. And you saw it not just in his words, but also he got a haircut. His makeup was different. He buttoned his coat for the first time ever.
Yeah.
This was a very presidential speech.
A very presidential speech.
He seemed presidential. I mean, even Democrats are saying that was a very presidential address.
A presidential kind of statement.
Trump struck a presidential tone.
Wow, new presidential tone?
The tone, the presidential demeanor.
The tone and the presidential nature of the speech.
Mr. Trump cast a more presidential image.
What you got is presidential modulation.
Some calling this his most presidential speech yet.
The most presidential speech, obviously, he has ever given.
He became presidential.
Donald Trump did indeed become presidential tonight.
I thought that he sounded finally very presidential. I'm using somebody else's words there because that's what somebody else I had heard. They felt that same thing.